All right, today we're diving into something, well, a little weird. A real scientific mystery. What happens when a scientist comes out with a huge, potentially game changing idea, one that could shake up everything we think we know about physics and math, and in return, they get crickets, just silence? Let's get into it. So picture this. You've poured years of your life into a breakthrough, a new idea. You finally publish it, and you're bracing for impact, right? You're expecting debate, arguments, maybe even a little bit of praise, but what you get is nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's the bizarre situation we're unpacking today. And this quote, this really gets to the heart of it. It's from the author at the center of this whole story. And you can just feel the frustration, can't you? They're not just confused, they're genuinely wondering what on earth is going on. Okay, so first step, let's really set the stage here. Let's talk about the new idea and the deafening silence that followed. So here's the deal. An author puts forward what they're calling a new perspective, and we're talking a fundamental, potentially huge shift in how we see things. But the very people who should be all over this, other scientists, researchers, academics, they say nothing. No real scientific questions, no serious challenges, just a void. So what kind of reaction was the author actually hoping for? Were they just looking for a pat on the back? Not even close. Let's dig into the massive questions they were trying to spark a debate about. Yeah, this was never about the small stuff. The author was ready for a heavyweight intellectual bout. They were basically inviting the scientific community into the ring to grapple with some of the biggest ideas out there. And just look at what we're talking about here. This is why the silence is so wild. They weren't just fiddling with an existing theory. They were questioning the very foundation of math and our concept of numbers. They were pointing to huge gaps in physics, proposing a whole new paradigm for how it works. They even took a hard look at the scientific method itself. I mean, these are about as fundamental as questions get, and they were just waiting for the conversation to start. Now, to be fair, they did get some questions, but the author pretty much dismissed them as halfway reasoning. Basically, as you can see here, they felt these questions were starting from the wrong place entirely, based on flawed assumptions. So you couldn't even have a real debate, which you can imagine only made things more frustrating. So this brings us to the million-dollar question, right? Why? Why the silence? Well, the author has a few theories. Okay, theory number 1. Maybe it's just a visibility problem. The world is a noisy place, there's a ton of information flying around. Maybe the right people just haven't even seen it yet. It could have just gotten lost in the shuffle. Possibility 2 is a bit colder. Apathy. Could it be that the scientific community saw the idea and just kind of shrugged? Maybe they decided it just wasn't important enough or interesting enough to even bother with. Then you've got theory number 3. And this one's a little more pointed. What if this isn't an accident? What if they're actively choosing to ignore this work? Maybe because it's just too radical, or it challenges the status quo a little too much. And finally, there's this fourth possibility, and it's a tough one to consider. You have to turn the question around and ask, was the problem the presentation? Maybe the way the idea was published, or the language that was used, just didn't pass the vibe check for the scientific establishment. And of course, there's always the chance that it's something else entirely, a reason nobody's even thought of yet. But whatever the cause, the mystery just keeps getting deeper. So, faced with this wall of silence, the author doesn't just sit back and wonder. No, they throw down a challenge, a direct challenge to the entire scientific community. Let's see what it is. It's a pretty brilliant logical challenge, actually. They basically say, look, my perspective has to be one of these 3 things. Either it's easy to prove wrong, it's hard to prove wrong, or it's impossible to prove wrong. And hey, even if it's impossible to refute, well, that's a problem in itself that's worth talking about, right? And this right here is the whole point. Silence isn't a scientific answer. According to the rules of science, an idea that's on the table has to be tested. It has to be engaged with, picked apart, and either proven or disproven. Just ignoring it, well, that's not part of the scientific method. Which brings us to our final question, the one that's really hanging over this whole situation. Where do we go from here? And this is the question that the author leaves us with. And it's so much bigger than just this one specific idea. It's about the health of science itself. How do we make sure that new, challenging, maybe even uncomfortable ideas get a fair shot? How do we make sure they get investigated instead of just being met with a wall of silence? It's a question that makes you think about how progress actually happens and what we might be missing out on when the conversation never even gets started.